Hey, I'm Jonathan, and today on Search the Scriptures, we're just going to look at a couple verses from Genesis 25. So hear the word of the Lord from Genesis 25 at verse 7. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in good old age, an old man full of years, and was gathered to his people. Then after that, his son Isaac and Ishmael come together. They bury him in the tomb or a cave that he had purchased in the field near Mamre with Sarah, his wife. And we have been following this story of the life of Abraham through our study of the book of Genesis from the 12th chapter, when the promise first came to him, when God called him out of Ur and said, follow me, I'm going to make you a father of many, of a great nation, and an offspring of yours is going to come and bless all the people of the earth. And Moses tells us he's lived now for 175 years. So this is a significant life that he has lived. When he was called by God, he was 75. So he has walked with God now for 100 years, and we've watched for many of those years. The promise of a child came, obviously, Isaac, after lots of learning, lots of growing and learning to trust that God would actually provide and accomplish the covenant. And then we've just kind of jumped forward 30 some years. Sarah has died. Abraham has sent his servant to find Rebekah to be a wife for Isaac. And then we hear that Abraham has come to the end. We think, well, how can we see anything worthwhile here? How can we see even Christ even imaged in this text or leading here? And we look at it, we think, well, here is a man who has left a legacy. And as we've followed through, we've seen so much of the example of Abraham, of even in the story of binding Isaac and being obedient to God's call to present him as a burnt offering, that he's even imaging for us the Father that would send Jesus as the Lamb for us. Or the other places in which the legacy and the model that Abraham gives us of somebody that hears of the promise of God, but then still has to learn. I mean, remember, he thought he had to take things into his own hands as he tries to impregnate Hagar, his concubine, that he might bring about a child that would be his offspring. But that wasn't to be the way. And so even though they thought that for 13 years, God says, no, Sarah is going to have a child. She will bear a son. His name will be Isaac, because there will be laughter. And so then Isaac comes, and the family will go on. The heir will perpetuate the dream. The promise will continue. And even from negotiating with God. Remember, when God comes and says Sodom has to be judged and dealt with, Abraham, in protection of his nephew Lot, will negotiate with God and say, don't do it. If you find even 10 righteous, like, don't do this. And he's negotiating with God. But by the time God calls him to offer his son, he just immediately obeys and goes. So there's been a learning, there's been a model for us of growth. But there's also spiritual dimensions to Abraham's legacy that are significant for us and that point to Jesus for us. And there's 4 key elements or spiritual dimensions of his legacy that we've seen in Abraham's story. And first is just faith, right? Early in the New Testament, will bring out these kind of 4 categories. In Romans 4, Paul talks about Abraham's faith. He ties it to our faith, right? He believed the Lord and was counted to him as righteousness when the promise came in Genesis 12 and 15, right? And so now we are, like Abraham, saved by faith as we believe. And then James will use this same story from Genesis 15 and talk about faith and works. He will see then in Genesis 22 the sacrifice or the binding of Isaac is an example of Abraham's obedience is as essential proof of his faith, and the works that follow as fruit of faith. And so he's showing us in his legacy that you don't just have faith that stands by itself, but there will actually be evidence that follows it, that your life will look different because you have faith. And then the third spiritual dimension is talked about by Paul in Galatians 3, and it's Christ himself, right? That Christ is the ultimate offspring of Abraham, the offspring that was to come and bless all the nations of the earth, that was promised ultimately by the Father, that goes all the way back to the garden, the serpent crusher that was coming through this line of Abraham's family. And if we then are in Christ, we too are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. This is such good news for us that we're part of Abraham's legacy. And then finally, his faithfulness, that he's given us an example in Hebrews 4. The author talks about Abraham's faithfulness just as an example of how the faithful live, with obedience, with hope, with confidence, with longing, with sacrifice, and with reasoning before God. So Abraham has guided us through a life of believing, of following, of obeying a God of promise, and witnessing the revelation of a God who has steadfast love for those that he calls, provision for those that he calls. He's a God who can be trusted. So if we learn from Abraham, it is that we can believe in Yahweh when he calls, and that we know he will provide. And he has, because he's given us Christ. So if we're in Christ, we are heirs according to the promise. We are offspring of Abraham, and that is glorious news. So even when we read of Abraham coming to the end of his days, we can rejoice because of his faithfulness. We have met Christ. So I'm Jonathan. Thanks for searching the scriptures with me. We'll see you soon.